I saw her, and suddenly the blank canvas wasn't the only thing waiting to be painted. Desire lingered in every brushstroke. The first time I saw her, the studio felt suddenly smaller, yet somehow brighter, as if her presence had filled the space with warmth I hadn't noticed before. She entered quietly, her heels clicking softly on the wooden floor, a measured, confident rhythm that contrasted with the chaos of brushes, paints, and scattered sketches surrounding me. At 42, she carried herself with a graceful assurance, each movement deliberate, yet there was a subtle hesitation in her gaze, like she was stepping into a world she didn't fully understand but was curious to explore. I remember noticing the way sunlight filtered through the tall windows, catching her hair in golden highlights. She paused in front of my easel, her fingers brushing lightly over the edge of a canvas. The scent of her perfume, faintly floral, comforting, mingled with the sharp, familiar smell of turpentine and oil paint. My heart caught in that brief moment, and I realized I had been holding my breath without even noticing. When she spoke, her voice was soft but confident, carrying an ease that came from experience. She asked about my sketches, lingering on the details, and I found myself watching her more than answering her questions. The curve of her neck as she leaned slightly forward, the delicate way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, it was magnetic without trying to be. At one point, I handed her a sketchbook, my fingers brushing hers in the exchange. The contact was fleeting, yet enough to send an unexpected warmth through me. She looked at me for a moment, her eyes holding mine a fraction longer than necessary, and I felt a silent curiosity in that gaze, a question neither of us dared to voice aloud. She wandered slowly through the studio, touching canvases and turning toward the sunlight to examine colors. I found myself wanting to capture her, not just her face, but the subtle movements, the quiet confidence, the slight vulnerability that peeked through her poised exterior. It was as if she were a living painting, and I was only beginning to understand the lines, shadows, and depth that made her so captivating. By the time she left, I realized I wasn't just thinking about her appearance, I was already drawn to her presence, the way she made the room feel alive, the way I wanted to understand her story. That first encounter wasn't dramatic, and there were no words of love or longing, yet something profound had shifted. I knew that in the weeks to come, she would become the center of my art, and, perhaps unknowingly, the center of my heart. A few days after our first encounter, I found myself pacing the studio, nervously rearranging brushes and canvases, wondering if she would actually accept my invitation. When she arrived, the air seemed charged with a quiet electricity. She paused at the door, one hand lightly resting on the frame, as if testing whether stepping inside would change the way she saw herself, or me. I wasn't sure, she said, her voice soft, a touch hesitant, but I thought I'd see how it feels. Her words, simple yet layered with curiosity and restraint, made my chest tighten. I gestured toward a chair beside the easel, and she moved toward it, every step deliberate, her poise effortless yet approachable. As she settled into the seat, I noticed the faint tremor of anticipation in her fingers as they rested on her lap. It was a subtle detail, almost imperceptible, yet it told me she was aware of the intimacy of the moment, being observed, being chosen as inspiration. We began with casual conversation about art, the city, the quiet solitude of a studio. Her eyes sparkled as she spoke, and I found myself leaning slightly closer, not to intrude, but to catch every nuance, the soft rise and fall of her voice, the careful way she articulated thoughts shaped by years of experience. There was a warmth to her laughter that made the room feel smaller, more intimate, as if the world outside had paused for just us. At one point, I reached to adjust her chair slightly so the light would fall better across her features. Our hands brushed, and the contact lingered just a heartbeat too long. Her eyes met mine, and there was a flicker of acknowledgement, a silent understanding of curiosity and intrigue. My heart skipped, but I forced myself to remain professional, letting the warmth of that brief contact speak louder than words. I noticed little details, the faint scent of her perfume mixing with the warm, paint-scented air, the gentle tilt of her head as she studied the sketches, the way her wrist flexed nervously when she wasn't sure where to place her hands. It was in these quiet, almost imperceptible gestures that our connection began to grow, an unspoken trust forming between us, delicate yet undeniable. By the end of the session, I realized something profound had shifted. The hesitation in her eyes had softened into curiosity, and the space between us, both physical and emotional, felt charged with possibilities. What began as a simple artistic collaboration was quietly becoming something more profound. In that brief afternoon, I sensed the first strokes of an intimacy that neither of us dared name yet, but both of us were beginning to feel. The day I started painting her, the studio seemed to shrink around us, the world outside fading into a soft blur. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, catching dust motes in the air and illuminating the delicate lines of her face. She sat patiently, adjusting slightly when I asked, yet there was a subtle stillness in her posture that made her seem both present and unreachable at the same time. I couldn't take my eyes off her, not in a crude way, but in the way an artist studies a living subject, trying to capture the truth beneath the surface. I began sketching, my brush moving tentatively at first, following the gentle curve of her jaw, the tilt of her shoulders, the quiet grace in the way she held herself. Every now and then, her eyes would meet mine, and the glance would linger a heartbeat too long, loaded with curiosity, unspoken questions, and attention neither of us yet named. She wasn't fidgeting, but the faint tremor of her fingers on her lap told me she felt it too. At one point, I leaned slightly to adjust the angle of her hand for the sketch. Our skin brushed lightly, a whisper of warmth, enough to make my heart race. She didn't pull away, instead holding her pose, and in that pause, I felt a quiet intimacy settle between us. The studio smelled of oil paint, turpentine, and her subtle perfume, an intoxicating mix that seemed to heighten my awareness of every small gesture she made. As the hours passed, we spoke little, letting the silence stretch comfortably between us. When she shifted slightly, I adjusted my brush and noticed how her hair fell softly against her neck. She tilted her head, brushing a strand behind her ear, and I caught the delicate curve of her smile in the corner of her lips. It was these fleeting moments, a glance, a breath, a soft tilt of her shoulder, that made the tension between us both exciting and fragile. Occasionally, she would study my work, leaning slightly toward the canvas. Her shoulder would graze mine, and the warmth of her presence felt grounding and thrilling at the same time. There was a rhythm forming, unspoken but undeniable, her quiet observance, my careful attention, a silent dialogue of trust, curiosity, and restrained longing. By the end of that first painting session, I realized something profound. The studio had become a space not just for art, but for connection. Every brushstroke carried a piece of the energy building between us, subtle and unspoken, yet undeniable. In her presence, I wasn't just capturing her likeness, I was learning to see her, truly see her, and in that act, a slow, steady bond began to form. It was delicate, tentative, and entirely magnetic. By the time our fourth session arrived, the studio had transformed. What had begun as a space filled with paint, brushes, and canvases now felt like a quiet sanctuary, a world where time seemed suspended, and only the two of us existed. She arrived with the same poised grace, but today, there was a softness in her gaze that hinted at an unspoken readiness to share more than just her image. As I set up my easel, I noticed the small gestures that spoke volumes, the way her fingers lingered over the edges of a paint tube, the slight curve of her lips when she thought I wasn't watching, the quiet rhythm of her breathing as she settled into the chair. It was in these subtleties that I realized I wasn't just painting her outward form, I was beginning to understand her inner world. I began sketching with a focus I had never felt before, allowing the brush to capture not only her shape but the quiet strength and vulnerability in her posture. After a long silence, she finally spoke, her voice softer than usual, carrying a weight of unspoken stories. "I've always admired people who can create something from nothing," she said. "To me, art is the closest we get to revealing who we truly are." Her words resonated deeply. I admitted, almost shyly, that she had inspired me, that her presence, her confidence wrapped in a quiet vulnerability, allowed me to see parts of myself I had kept hidden. For the first time, she didn't smile politely, instead, she tilted her head, eyes searching mine, and I could see the hint of emotional vulnerability behind her composed exterior. Our hands brushed briefly as I reached for a new brush, and neither of us pulled away. The contact was simple, yet it carried the weight of mutual understanding and trust. She leaned slightly forward to study a sketch, her shoulder grazing mine. I felt the warmth radiating from her, grounding me, and in that simple touch, the tension between us deepened, not as desire alone, but as the quiet recognition of emotional intimacy forming. We spoke more openly after that, sharing fragments of our pasts, our regrets, and small, hidden desires. She spoke of moments she wished she had embraced differently, and I shared the insecurities that drove my art. In that safe, quiet space, the age gap between us felt irrelevant. What mattered was the honesty, the trust, and the silent acknowledgement that we were both navigating the vulnerability of connection. By the end of the session, the sketches reflected more than her likeness. They captured the essence of our shared moment, the fragile, tentative intimacy that was growing stronger with every brushstroke, every lingering glance, and every soft touch. For the first time, I felt that this was no longer just a painting session. It was the beginning of something profound, quietly unfolding, and entirely ours. By the fifth session, the studio had become more than just a place to paint. It had transformed into a private world, where time slowed and the outside clamor faded. The sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting soft golden beams that illuminated her face, her hands, the gentle rise and fall of her shoulders. Every detail felt magnified, every small gesture more significant than it would have seemed in a regular day. She arrived with the same graceful composure, but there was a subtle shift, a quiet anticipation that neither of us dared acknowledge in words. As she settled into her chair, I noticed the way her eyes lingered on my sketches, and I could feel the faint warmth radiating from her presence. The air between us was charged, but it was the kind of electricity that came from trust and curiosity rather than overt desire. We worked in silence at first, the brushstrokes moving with the rhythm of our mutual understanding. Occasionally, she would lean slightly closer to examine a sketch, her shoulder brushing against mine. Each touch was fleeting, yet it left a trace, a pulse of warmth, a quiet awareness of how close we had grown. I felt my own breath catch during these moments, the subtle contact resonating deeper than I expected. During a pause, she adjusted the angle of her head, her fingers grazing her hair as she studied a painting. I stepped closer to correct the light on her face, and our hands brushed accidentally. She didn't pull away, only glanced at me with a softness that made my chest tighten. There was a silent communication in that simple gesture, a quiet acknowledgement of the tension building between us. We laughed lightly at small observations, a streak of paint on my hand, a smudge on the canvas, but even the laughter carried an undercurrent of intimacy. The studio smelled of oil paint, turpentine, and her faint perfume, creating a heady mix that made every glance and every touch more intense. By the end of the session, I realized that our connection had deepened in ways neither of us could ignore. The closeness, the fleeting touches, the lingering glances, all of it had created an invisible thread, pulling us towards something we were only beginning to understand. For a moment, the age gap felt irrelevant. What mattered was the quiet, unspoken desire to be near one another, to share these moments of vulnerability and connection in the safe cocoon we had built together. As she left the studio that day, her eyes met mine one final time, and I sensed it, the silent acknowledgement that what had begun as a simple artistic collaboration was now becoming a slow, irresistible dance of hearts, drawing us closer with every brushstroke, every shared silence, and every fleeting touch. By the sixth session, the studio had taken on a golden hue, the late afternoon sunlight spilling through the tall windows and draping everything in warmth. The sketches and paintings around us no longer felt like mere objects of creation, they were silent witnesses to the bond that had grown between us, subtle and unspoken, but undeniably strong. The air was thick with anticipation, yet there was also a sense of respect, a careful restraint that made every gesture and glance more meaningful. She arrived with her usual elegance, but today there was a softness in her eyes, a hint of vulnerability that made my heart ache with both longing and tenderness. As she settled into her chair, I felt the familiar pull, the quiet magnetism that had been building with each session, growing more palpable, more intimate. We worked in near silence, only the soft scratch of pencil against paper and the occasional swish of the brush filling the room. I noticed how her posture subtly shifted as I leaned in to adjust her hand for the sketch, how her hair caught the light, and how her gaze would drift toward me, holding for just a heartbeat longer than usual. Each of these moments carried a weight, a silent acknowledgement of the tension simmering between us. Finally, as I stepped back to survey the nearly finished painting, I found myself speaking softly, almost reverently, "You're a blank canvas, and I want to paint my desire on you." My voice was low, careful, letting the words carry emotion rather than seduction. She froze for a heartbeat, her eyes wide, then softened as she met my gaze. There was no immediate answer, only a quiet understanding, the acknowledgement of feelings that had grown slowly, carefully, over the weeks we had spent together. Our hands brushed accidentally while I reached for a brush. This time, there was no hesitation, only a gentle warmth, the unspoken language of proximity. She didn't pull away, instead, she let the moment stretch, allowing the tension to exist without forcing it into words. It was electric, intimate, but never rushed, a perfect reflection of the slow, deliberate connection we had nurtured. The studio seemed to shrink around us, the world outside irrelevant. Sunlight illuminated her features, the soft lines of her face, the graceful tilt of her head. Every breath, every subtle movement, every flicker of her expression spoke of trust, curiosity, and a desire that was as emotional as it was physical. By the end of the session, the unspoken bond between us had reached its peak. Desire, respect, and tenderness intertwined seamlessly. In that quiet space, I realized that the connection we had cultivated was more than attraction, it was a profound emotional intimacy, a dance of hearts and minds that honored both the age gap and the delicate vulnerability that had brought us together. The final session arrived, and the studio felt both familiar and extraordinary, a place that had quietly witnessed the evolution of something much deeper than a mere artistic collaboration. Sunlight filtered through the windows in soft, golden streams, illuminating the easel, the scattered brushes, and, most importantly, her face. She entered with that effortless grace, yet today there was a quiet anticipation in her eyes, as if she understood that what we had been building together was reaching its own kind of completion. As I unveiled the final painting, I held my breath. It wasn't just a portrait, it was a story captured in color, light, and shadow, a reflection of the moments we had shared, the quiet glances, the accidental touches, the laughter and silences that had grown into something tender, slow, and profound. She studied it with a delicate tilt of her head, her fingers brushing lightly over the edge of the canvas, and I could see awe, recognition, and something deeper flickering in her eyes. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her voice catching ever so slightly. "It feels alive." I stepped closer, just enough that our shoulders brushed, and felt the warmth radiating from her. "It's because you let it," I said softly. "Because of everything you shared, your presence, your trust." Her hand brushed mine almost instinctively, lingering longer than necessary. It wasn't bold, but it was deliberate, a simple acknowledgement of the bond that had grown between us. Our eyes met, holding a quiet conversation of emotions, gratitude, curiosity, admiration, and that slow-burning connection that had brought us here. For a long moment, we simply stood there, the studio wrapped around us like a cocoon. The sunlight caught the subtle highlights in her hair, the warmth of her skin, and the gentle curve of her lips as she offered a small, genuine smile. I felt a deep sense of calm, of rightness, knowing that what had developed between us was real, profound, respectful, and entirely mutual. Before she left, we shared one final touch, a brief, tender hand on hand, a soft press of palms that conveyed more than words ever could. Her gaze lingered on mine, and I could feel the silent promise of connection, the acknowledgement that this story, our story, had found its home in both of us. As the door closed behind her, I remained by the easel, taking in the painting, the studio, and the quiet aftermath of our journey. The age gap, the hesitation, the uncertainty, all of it faded in importance. What remained was intimacy, trust, and the kind of slow, enduring desire that didn't need to be rushed or forced. It had unfolded naturally, deliberately, and beautifully. The final brushstroke wasn't on the canvas, it was in the space between us, in the warmth of a glance, in the quiet knowledge that we had both been seen, understood, and cherished. The story had reached its gentle, luminous conclusion, a slow-burn romance fully realized, satisfying, and unforgettable. If this slow-burn love story captured your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more age-gap romance tales that unfold slowly, beautifully, and emotionally. Share your thoughts in the comments. Which moment between them made you feel the spark the most?